His fingers traced the scar at my nape, and the entire court fell silent. "She has always been mine," he declared, his voice cutting through the candlelit hall like a blade through silk. I felt my knees weaken as every eye turned to me, the nameless Omega they despised, now claimed by their king before God and court. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10, and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. When I opened my eyes, the world had no name. The air smelled of wet earth and ancient wood, and my hands trembled as though something had been torn from me during sleep. I woke in sheets I didn't recognize, beneath a ceiling of dark beams and tall windows where morning light entered timidly, carving out particles of dust that seemed to float between worlds. I didn't remember my name, only the sensation of having been ripped from somewhere I shouldn't have been. It was as if time itself had spat me out, leaving me naked of everything except a strange ache pulsing at the nape of my neck, where a thin scar seemed to burn like a seal. They called me the Lost One. The servants whispered when I passed, their hands always too busy to feign indifference. They spoke in low tones, but I felt the weight of fear in every syllable. They said I came from the lands beyond the river, a place that, according to them, no alpha would allow to be touched. The house where I'd awakened was cold, made of ancient stones, and each corridor seemed to hold old breaths, echoes of secrets no one dared pronounce. The tapestries showed scenes of hunts and coronations, but all appeared stained by time or by something denser, as if the glory they represented had been bought with pain. The first time I heard the sound of his footsteps, the air seemed to stop. They called him my lord, but the name was spoken with tense reverence, almost devotional. When he entered the hall, conversations ceased. The entire world shrank before his presence, and so did I. The Alpha King, the man who governed these lands with the same calm one has when holding a blade. Tall, impenetrable eyes of deep grey that seemed to know secrets I didn't yet suspect I possessed. There was something in him that wounded my instinct while simultaneously drawing me in like fire draws the creature that knows it will burn. "So it's you," he said, and his voice sounded deep, as though dragging the weight of eras. "The one who wakes without a name." I felt blood pulse in my ears. I wanted to respond, but words fled from me. He approached, the scent of leather and ash filling the space between us. His gaze settled on my scar, and for an instant the world seemed to bend to silence. There was recognition in his eyes, not surprise, not curiosity. Recognition, as if he was seeing me for the second time. The days that followed were slow, suffocating. The court ladies whispered around me, their laughter thin as blades. They said the king had brought a foreigner, a nameless Omega, and that this was a scandal. None of them addressed me directly, but all of them watched. I was the mirror of what they feared, the element that didn't belong to the court's perfect order. He, however, seemed indifferent to venomous tongues. When we crossed paths in the corridors, his gaze found mine, and in that gaze was a kind of silent prison, a dominion that needed no words. One night I was summoned to the main hall. There was a ceremony, something about alliances and oaths, but no one had explained why I should be there. The walls were covered with candles, and the air smelled of wax and red wine. When I entered, I felt all eyes fix on me, as if I were an intruder in a sacred ritual. He was on the throne, surrounded by counselors and ladies dressed in gold. When he saw me, he rose. A murmur rippled through the hall. "This is she," he announced, his voice serene but firm enough to cut through fear. "The one who has belonged to me since before any oath." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. I felt my legs falter, my heart lose its rhythm. I didn't know what he meant, but the impact was real, as if the ground beneath my feet had turned to glass. Someone laughed in the back, one of those laughs disguised as incredulity. Another lady with green eyes and a cold smile murmured loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Belong? A nameless Omega? The king has lost his mind." He didn't look away from me. He walked slowly to where I stood, and each step seemed to echo against my skin. When he drew near, he leaned close enough for his voice to brush my ear. The words came low, almost like a memory. "You have always been mine." The phrase didn't sound like a right. It sounded like destiny, something that existed even before I knew it existed. I felt air trapped in my chest, the world spinning slowly, and a distant memory began to form. A forest, a night, an oath spoken beneath the moon. But before I could grasp the meaning, the sound of laughter and murmurs dragged me back to the present. I stood before everyone exposed, and he had marked my nameless existence with the words of a king. After that, the castle was never the same. Doors closed when I passed. Glances came loaded with contempt and fear. They said I had bewitched the Alpha, that my presence would bring ruin. But he watched me from afar, with that gaze that said everything his mouth wouldn't. And at night, when wind crossed through the cracks and moonlight carved my face in the mirror, I felt there was something in him that called to me, not as a master calls a servant, but as destiny calls what has been stolen from it. I still didn't know who I'd been before that awakening. I only knew that since then, the sound of his voice pursued me, repeating in every beat of my heart the same impossible sentence, "You have always been mine." The corridors became a labyrinth of whispered accusations. I caught fragments of conversations that died the moment I appeared, leaving only the bitter residue of judgment in the air. Lady Morgaine, the king's cousin and the most beautiful woman at court, made no effort to hide her disdain. Her eyes, the colour of summer grass, followed me with the precision of a huntress tracking wounded prey. "Tell me, lost one?" she said one afternoon, cornering me in the library where I'd sought refuge among ancient books whose words I could barely decipher. "What sorcery did you use? What dark bargain brought you to his bed?" "I'm not in his bed," I whispered, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. Her laugh was crystalline, sharp. "Not yet. But he looks at you as though you already bear his mark, as though you're something precious he's been searching for." She stepped closer, and I smelled lavender, and something underneath it, something acrid like jealousy turned to poison. "You should know that women far greater than you have tried and failed to capture his attention. Queens have been rejected. What makes you, a nothing with no name, worthy of his obsession?" I had no answer. How could I explain what I didn't understand myself? The connection between us felt older than memory, deeper than reason. It lived in my bones like an ache I'd been born with. "Perhaps," I said, finding a thread of courage, "it's not about worthiness. Perhaps some things simply are." Her hand moved so fast I barely saw it. The slap rang out like a crack of thunder in the silent library, and my cheek burned with the imprint of her fury. "You forget your place," she hissed. "You're nothing here. Nothing but a curiosity that will fade once he tires of your mystery." I tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. The pain grounded me, made me reel in a world where I felt like a ghost. I met her gaze without flinching, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Uncertainty. Fear. "We'll see," I said softly. That night, I dreamed of the forest. In the dream, I was running, my bare feet bleeding on stones and roots, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Someone was chasing me, or perhaps I was chasing something. The trees grew thick around me, their branches clawing at my hair and clothes. And then I saw him, standing in a clearing bathed in moonlight. He was younger in the dream, but I knew him instantly. His grey eyes held the same intensity, the same inexplicable recognition. "You promised," he said, and his voice carried the weight of years. "You swore you would return." I tried to speak, to tell him I didn't remember, but my voice wouldn't come. And then the dream shifted, twisted. The forest burned. The moon turned red as blood. And I woke gasping, my hands clutched to the scar at my neck, which throbbed as though freshly made. The days blurred together in a haze of suspicious glances and careful avoidance. I learned to walk the castle's edges, to make myself small and unnoticed. But he found me anyway. He always found me. It happened in the rose garden, where I'd gone to escape the suffocating weight of the castle walls. The flowers were in full bloom, their scent almost overwhelming, petals like drops of blood against green leaves. I was sitting on a stone bench, my fingers tracing the carved patterns worn smooth by countless hands before mine, when his shadow fell across me. "They're treating you poorly," he said. It wasn't a question. I looked up at him, at the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, at the hardness of his jaw and the unexpected gentleness in his eyes. I'm used to it. You shouldn't be. He sat beside me, close enough that I felt the warmth radiating from his body. Tell me what you remember, before you woke here. Nothing, I admitted. Only fragments. Pieces that don't fit together. Sometimes I dream, and in the dreams there's a forest and fire and... I hesitated. And you're always there. His hand moved to my neck, fingers finding the scar with unerring precision. The touch sent electricity down my spine, made my breath catch. This mark, he said quietly. Do you know what it means? I shook my head. It's a binding scar. Ancient magic, forbidden magic. The kind that ties two souls together across lifetimes. His thumb traced the raised skin and I shivered. I've carried the matching mark for 10 years, ever since the night I made an oath I thought I'd never be able to keep. What oath? To find you. To bring you home. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Even if it took forever. Even if I had to tear apart the fabric of time itself. My heart hammered against my ribs. I don't understand. You will. He pulled his hand away and I felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. But first you need to remember. And they'll do everything in their power to prevent that. They? The court, the old families. They fear what you represent. He stood looking down at me with an expression I couldn't read. Change, the end of their carefully maintained order. They'll try to break you to drive you away or destroy you. You need to be ready. Ready for what? But he was already walking away, leaving me alone with the roses and more questions than answers. The attack came 3 days later. I was in my chambers preparing for bed when the door burst open. 3 women entered, their faces covered with silk masks, their hands holding torn pieces of fabric that I recognized as my own meager possessions. Thief, one of them hissed. You think you can steal what belongs to others? I haven't stolen anything, I protested, backing away. Your very presence is theft. Another woman advanced, and I saw the glint of scissors in her hand. You steal his attention, his protection, his time that should belong to women of proper birth and breeding. They surrounded me, and I felt panic rise in my throat. The scissors flashed toward my hair, my clothes. Hands grabbed at me, pulling and tearing. I fought back, scratching and kicking, but they were stronger, more numerous. I felt fabric rip, felt cold air on my skin, felt the bite of blades against my scalp. And then the door exploded inward with a force that shook the walls. He stood in the doorway and the rage emanating from him was palpable, a living thing that made the air crackle. The women froze, their masks slipping to reveal faces I recognized. Lady Morgaine, Lady Catherine, Lady Isabeau. Leave, he said, and the single word carried such menace that they fled, scrambling over each other in their haste to escape his wrath. I stood trembling in the wreckage of my room, my clothes torn, my hair hacked short on one side, blood trickling from small cuts across my arms. I must have looked pathetic, a broken thing barely holding itself together. But when I met his eyes, I saw something that stole my breath. Not pity, not disgust. Fury, yes, but beneath it, a tenderness so intense it hurt to witness. He moved toward me slowly as though approaching a wounded animal. His hands were gentle as they examined my injuries, his touch feather light on my skin. I should have protected you better, he murmured. I should have known they would escalate. Why do you care? The words burst from me raw and desperate. Why does a nameless Omega matter to a king? Because you're not nameless. He cupped my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him. Your name is Ilara. You're the daughter of the moon priestess of the Riverlands. And 10 years ago, on the night of your 18th birthday, you bound yourself to me with magic older than kingdoms. The world tilted. The name resonated in my chest like a bell I'd forgotten existed. Ilara. Yes, that was who I'd been. Who I was. Why don't I remember? Because they took it from you. The Riverlands were destroyed by those who feared the old magic. Your mother sent you forward through time to save you, but the spell damaged your memories. I've been waiting, searching for 10 years. His voice broke on the last words. I'd almost given up hope. Tears burned my eyes. The dreams, the forest, that was real. All of it. Every moment. Every promise. He pressed his forehead to mine and I felt something inside me click into place, like a lock finally finding its key. You asked me once what oath I'd sworn. I told you I would love you beyond death, beyond time, beyond all the laws of men and gods. And I've kept that oath. The memories came flooding back then, a decade of missing pieces suddenly made whole. I remembered the forest temple where I'd trained as a priestess. I remembered my mother's face, beautiful and terrible in her power. I remembered the night I'd met him, a young king from the northern lands who'd come seeking alliance with the river priestesses. I remembered falling in love with the impossibility of him, with his quiet strength and the way he looked at me as though I were the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. And I remembered the binding ceremony, the way we'd carved matching scars into each other's necks beneath the full moon, our blood mingling as we spoke the ancient words. I remembered the feeling of our souls intertwining, becoming something greater than either of us alone. I remembered the promise that not even death could break what we'd created. "The court will never accept this," I whispered against his chest, where he'd drawn me close. "They'll fight you every step of the way." "Let them try." His arms tightened around me, protective and possessive all at once. "I've waited 10 years to have you back. I won't lose you again to politics or fear, or the small-minded cruelty of those who can't understand what we are. But understanding the depth of their opposition and surviving it were two different things. The next morning, I woke to find my door barred from the outside, guards posted to ensure I couldn't leave. When I demanded answers, they told me the king was in council and had ordered I remain in my chambers for my own protection. But I knew better. This wasn't his order. This was the court moving against me while they had the chance. I spent 3 days locked in that room. Food came twice daily, delivered by servants who wouldn't meet my eyes. No one spoke to me. No one told me what was happening in the world beyond my door. I felt my newly recovered memories slipping through my fingers like water. Panic setting in that I'd lose myself again, that they'd find some way to strip me of everything I'd just regained. On the 4th day, Lady Morgaine came. She entered without knocking, her green silk dress rustling like leaves in a poisoned garden. In her hands, she carried a silver tray with a single glass of deep red wine. "A gift," she said, setting it on the table beside my bed. "From the king. He asks that you drink it and rest. He says the memories must be overwhelming, and this will help you sleep peacefully." Every instinct screamed danger. The king would come himself. The king is occupied with matters of state, matters that concern your future here. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. "You should drink. It would be wise to show gratitude for his concern." I looked at the wine, at the way candlelight caught in its depths like blood. "What's in it?" "Medicine, for the pain of remembering." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Or you can refuse and we'll know that you don't truly trust him. That you're not the bound soul he claims you to be. That you're just a frightened girl playing at being something greater than yourself." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a trap snapping shut. I stared at the wine for long minutes, my heart a drum in my chest. Was this truly from him? Or was it another attack, more subtle than scissors and torn clothes, but no less deadly? I thought about the binding, about the way our souls had merged that night a decade ago. If we were truly connected as he claimed, as I now remembered, wouldn't I feel it if something was wrong? Wouldn't I know bone deep whether to trust or fear? I picked up the glass, brought it to my lips, and poured every drop out the window into the garden below. The reaction came faster than I expected. Within an hour, shouting echoed through the corridors. Doors slammed. And then he was there, my door crashing open, his eyes wild with something between fury and fear. "Did you drink it?" he demanded. "Tell me you didn't drink it." "No," I said, and watched relief crash over his face like a wave. I poured it out. "What was it?" "Nightshade and hemlock mixed with moon thistle. Enough to stop your heart within minutes." He pulled me against him, and I felt him shaking. "They tried to poison you in my name, using my seal on the message." Morgaine brought it. "I know. She's in chains now. So are the others. Catherine, Isabeau, 6 more who were part of the conspiracy." His voice was ragged, raw. "They thought if you died, the binding would break. That I'd be free of you and marry one of them to secure their family's power. What will you do with them? What law demands? They attacked the king's bound mate. That's treason." He pulled back enough to look at me, and I saw something dark and terrible in his eyes. "They'll be exiled to the outer territories, stripped of title and lands. Their families will bear the shame for generations. That seems harsh. They tried to murder you. Each word came out sharp as a blade. If anything, I'm being merciful. The old laws would demand their heads. I understood then the weight of what I'd become to him, what I'd always been. Not just a lover or a companion, but something fundamental to his existence, the other half of his soul. To harm me was to harm him, and a king couldn't allow such attacks to go unpunished without appearing weak. When will you tell them, I asked, the full court, the truth about who I am, what we are? Tomorrow night, there's to be a gathering, all the noble houses in attendance. I'll make the announcement then, properly, with all the weight of law and tradition behind it. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. I'm going to name you my queen, Ilara, my bound mate and equal, and anyone who objects will face the same fate as those who tried to kill you. Fear and exhilaration warred in my chest. They'll rebel. The old families will never accept a river priestess as queen. Then they'll learn to live with disappointment. Or they'll leave my lands and find some other king to serve. His smile was fierce, feral. I've waited 10 years for you. I won't wait another day to claim you publicly, to give you the crown and title that have always been yours by right of our binding. That night, alone in my chambers with guards he'd personally chosen standing watch outside my door, I tried to prepare myself for what was coming. I knew the announcement would cause chaos. The Riverlands had been destroyed because people feared the old magic, feared the power that priestesses like my mother wielded. To suddenly learn that their king had been bound to one of us all along, that he intended to place one of us on the throne, would shake the foundations of everything they believed about power and bloodlines and divine right. I dressed carefully the next evening, choosing a gown of deep midnight blue that made my skin glow like moonlight. A servant had been sent to fix my hair, to disguise the damage done by cruel scissors, and she'd woven it into an intricate crown of braids studded with small crystals that caught the light. When I looked in the mirror, I saw not the frightened, nameless girl who'd woken in this castle, but someone stronger, someone who'd survived attempts on her life, who'd reclaimed her stolen memories, who'd found her way back across time itself to the man she loved. The great hall was packed with nobles when I entered. Every important family in the kingdom had sent representatives, drawn by rumors of a major announcement. Candles blazed in silver sconces, and the air smelled of expensive perfumes and ambition. Conversations died as I walked through the crowd, my head held high despite the weight of hostile stares. He stood at the front of the hall, magnificent in black and silver, the crown of his office gleaming in candlelight. When he saw me, something shifted in his expression, softening the harsh lines of power into something almost tender. He held out his hand, and I took it, feeling the calluses from sword training, the warmth of his skin against mine. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the vast space. "I've called you here tonight to witness and acknowledge a truth that has been hidden for too long. 10 years ago, I travelled to the Riverlands and participated in a sacred binding ceremony with the daughter of the Moon Priestess. We swore oaths that transcend mortal law, that tie our very souls together for all of time." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered with a sound like breaking ice. When the Riverlands fell, she was sent forward through time by her mother's magic, appearing here without memory or name. I've spent a decade searching for her, and now that she's returned, I will not hide what she is to me. This is Ilara, daughter of the Moon Priestess Lysandra, bound mate of my soul, and by right of our sacred oath, she is your queen. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like a dam breaking, the hall erupted. Voices raised in shock, anger, disbelief. An elderly lord near the front stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "This is madness," he shouted. "You cannot expect us to bow to some witch who claims powers we don't understand, who comes from a people destroyed for their dangerous magic. I expect you to honor your oaths to your king," he said coldly, "just as I have honored mine. But she's not legitimate. There's no proper marriage, no blessing from the high priests, no contract between families." A woman this time, her voice shrill with panic. This binding you speak of isn't recognized by our laws or our gods. Then our laws and gods are incomplete. He pulled me closer, his arm around my waist, possessive and protective. The binding ritual predates your kingdoms, your religions, your concept of legitimacy. It's magic at its most fundamental, older than crowns or thrones. What Alara and I share cannot be undone by your disapproval or dissolved by your laws. You're asking us to accept a fundamental change to everything we believe about power and succession, said another lord, his voice more measured but no less concerned. What happens to the bloodlines? What happens when you have children? Will they be considered legitimate heirs if their mother was never properly married? Any child born of our binding will be legitimate by the oldest law there is, the law of magic and soul connection. His voice hardened. And anyone who questions their right to the throne will answer to me personally. The hall descended into chaos again. Arguments broke out between families. Some lords began to leave, their faces set in lines of stubborn rejection. Others remained, looking uncertain, torn between loyalty to their king and fear of the unknown. And then an old woman pushed through the crowd. She wore simple grey robes, her hair white as snow, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and clear. I recognized her from my recovered memories, one of the lesser priestesses who'd served at the river temple, one who'd survived the destruction by hiding her powers. I witnessed this binding, she said, her voice creaking but strong. I was there the night these two swore their oaths. I saw the magic that bound them. I saw the way their souls recognized each other, the way the moon herself seemed to bless their union. She turned to face the crowd. You fear what you don't understand, but your fear doesn't make this less real. These two are bound in ways your marriages could never replicate. Their connection exists beyond flesh, beyond law, beyond even death itself. Her words seemed to carry weight that mine and his combined hadn't. Perhaps because she was old. Perhaps because she represented a tradition that even in destruction commanded respect. The chaos began to settle into uneasy murmurs. There must be some compromise, said a younger lord. One I remembered had always been more progressive in council. Some way to acknowledge the king's binding while also addressing the concerns of tradition. Perhaps a formal ceremony according to our customs, even if the spiritual binding already exists. I'm willing to participate in whatever ceremonies satisfy your need for tradition, I said, speaking for the first time. My voice rang clear across the hall, stronger than I'd known I could be. But understand this, I won't pretend the binding doesn't exist. I won't diminish what we are to make you comfortable. I am his bound mate, his queen by right of the oldest magic. Everything else is simply decoration. A man in the back laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Listen to her, speaking as though she has authority. She's been here mere weeks, knows nothing of our ways, our politics, our history. What makes her fit to rule beside our king? I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and fierce. The memories of my training as a priestess came flooding back. All the years of study, of learning to read the patterns of power and politics, of understanding how to lead and guide and judge. I'd been groomed from childhood to be a leader, to wield authority with wisdom and compassion. I know more than you think, I said. And power crept into my voice, the old magic that lived in my blood responding to my emotion. I was trained from age 5 to read men's hearts, to see truth through deception, to judge fairly and lead wisely. I've studied philosophy, strategy, history, law. I may not know your specific customs, but I know people. I know power. And I know that true leadership comes not from accident of birth, but from the willingness to serve those you lead. The air itself seemed to shimmer around me, responding to the magic in my blood. Candle flames grew brighter, reaching toward me like flowers toward the sun. I saw fear in some faces, but also a reluctant respect. Power, they understood. Power commanded attention even when it frightened. He squeezed my hand, pride evident in his face. You see now what I've known all along. She's no weak foreign girl to be dismissed or controlled. She's a priestess of the old ways, trained in arts we've forgotten, connected to forces we barely understand. And she's mine, as I am hers, bound by magic that will outlast all of your petty politics and territorial concerns. We need time, said the elderly lord who'd first objected, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. Time to adjust, to understand. You can't expect us to simply accept this overnight. I've given you 10 years, he said flatly. That's all the time you're getting. Tomorrow she'll be crowned. The ceremony will follow your traditions to satisfy your need for familiar ritual, but the outcome isn't up for debate. Ilara is my queen. Anyone who can't accept that is free to leave my lands and seek service elsewhere. One by one, the lords and ladies began to kneel. Some did so willingly, recognizing the inevitable. Others knelt reluctantly, faces tight with resentment. A few turned and walked out, their footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. But most stayed, most bent their knees, and most murmured the words of fealty. When it was done, when the last lord had risen from his knees and the crowd had begun to disperse into smaller clusters of intense conversation, he pulled me aside into a private alcove behind the throne. That was magnificent, he said, his hands framing my face. The way you stood up to them, the way you let them see your power. I've never been more proud or more in love. I was terrified, I admitted. I thought they'd riot. I thought they'd try to drag me out of here. Some wanted to, but you made them see you're not someone to be dismissed or destroyed. You're a force they have to reckon with. He kissed me then, soft and deep, and I felt the binding pulse between us, our souls singing in harmony. Tomorrow you'll wear a crown, but tonight, let me show you how a king honors his queen. The coronation came with dawn. The ceremony was elaborate, filled with incense and chanting, with priests blessing me according to traditions that felt foreign to my priestess training, but which I endured for the sake of peace. The crown they placed on my head was heavy, gold worked with silver and set with moonstones that seemed to glow with inner light. When I stood beside him on the dais, our hands joined, I felt the weight of history settling onto my shoulders. But I also felt something else, something that made the weight bearable. I felt his presence beside me, steady and sure. I felt the binding thrumming between us, that connection that had survived time and death and every attempt to sever it. And I felt, for the first time since waking nameless and afraid, that I was exactly where I belonged. The feast that followed was lavish, but tensions ran high. I caught hostile glances from certain corners, heard whispered conversations that died when I drew near. But I also found unexpected allies. The young progressive lord approached me during the dancing, bowing low. "Your Majesty," he said, and the title sounded strange and wonderful on his lips. I wanted to apologize for the rudeness of last night, and to offer my family's full support. I believe this binding, this connection between you and our king, is exactly what our kingdom needs. A bridge between the old magic and the new order. Thank you, I said sincerely. I know this isn't easy for many people. Change never is. No, but it's necessary. We've become too rigid, too afraid of anything that doesn't fit our narrow definitions of power and legitimacy. You're a reminder that there are forces in this world greater than our laws and customs. He smiled. I think you'll be a fine queen. Better than fine, actually. I think you'll be extraordinary. As the night wore on, more people approached with similar sentiments. Not everyone, not even a majority, but enough. Enough to build on, to create a foundation of support. The old woman who'd testified to the binding found me near midnight, her eyes twinkling with secret knowledge. "You've done well, child," she said. "Your mother would be proud." "Do you know what happened to her?" I asked, hungry for any scrap of information about the family I'd lost. "After she sent me forward?" The old woman's face grew sad. She held the temple as long as she could, giving the other priestesses time to escape. When the soldiers finally broke through, she used the last of her power to seal the temple, to ensure its secrets couldn't be stolen or destroyed. They say the earth itself swallowed the ruins, that now there's only forest where the temple once stood. Tears burned my eyes. She died protecting the old ways. She died protecting you. Everything she did in those final days was to ensure you'd survive, that you'd have a chance at the happiness she saw in her visions of the future. The old woman squeezed my hand. She saw this moment, you know? She saw you crowned and loved and powerful. That knowledge gave her strength at the end. I wish I could have saved her. You honor her by living well, by embracing the power she gave you, by being the queen she knew you could be. The old woman smiled. Now go to your king. He's been watching you all night with the eyes of a man starving for a glimpse of water. I found him on a balcony overlooking the gardens, his face turned toward the moon. When he heard me approach, he turned, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. "Finally," he said. "I've been waiting to get you alone all day. You could have just ordered everyone away. You're the king, and you're the queen. I won't start our reign by being a tyrant, even if I desperately want to steal you away from all of this." He pulled me into his arms and I melted against him, feeling the tension of the day drain away. "How are you holding up?" "I'm exhausted, overwhelmed, terrified I'm going to fail somehow." "You won't fail. You're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and wiser than you think." He tilted my face up to his. "And you're not alone. You'll never be alone again. That's what the binding means. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," I echoed, and kissed him beneath the stars. The months that followed weren't easy. There were attempts to undermine me, whispered campaigns to paint me as a sorceress who'd enslaved the king with dark magic. Several noble families withdrew from court, refusing to acknowledge my authority. But there were victories too. I established a new council that included voices from common people, not just nobility. I reopened investigations into crimes that had been swept under the rug, ensuring justice for those who'd been denied it. I used my priestess training to mediate disputes, to see through lies to the truth beneath. Slowly, grudgingly, even my harshest critics began to see that I wasn't the threat they'd feared. I wasn't trying to destroy their way of life or impose foreign customs. I was simply trying to lead with wisdom and compassion, to bring the best of the old magic into harmony with the new order. And through it all, the binding held. At night, when I lay beside him in the royal chambers, I felt our souls intertwined, two flames burning as one. The scar on my neck no longer ached. It sang with connection, with belonging, with love that transcended every boundary mortality tried to impose. A year after my coronation, standing once again in the great hall surrounded by nobles who'd come to celebrate the anniversary of our public binding, I realized something profound. I'd spent so long thinking of myself as lost, as someone who'd been torn from where she belonged. But I'd been wrong. I hadn't been lost. I'd been on a journey, following a path that wound through time itself to arrive exactly where I was meant to be. "What are you thinking?" he whispered in my ear as we danced, the court watching with expressions ranging from approval to resignation to genuine warmth. "That I'm home," I said simply. "For the first time since I can remember, I'm truly home." His arms tightened around me. "You've always been my home. From the moment I saw you in that forest temple, I knew my soul had found its resting place. Then I suppose we're both home now. And always will be," he promised. "Through this life and whatever comes after. That's what the binding means. That's what you've always been to me." I looked around the hall, at the tapestries showing our joined crests, at the people who'd learned to accept me, at the life we'd built together from fragments of memory and impossible magic. It wasn't perfect. There were still those who resented me, still challenges we'd face, still dangers lurking in the shadows. But we'd face them together, bound by love and magic and a promise that not even time could break. "You have always been mine," he'd told me that first night, and now I understood the full weight of those words. Not possession, but recognition. The acknowledgement that some connections run deeper than choice or chance, that some souls are meant to find each other across every obstacle fate can create. I was the lost one who'd been found, the nameless who'd been named, the Omega who'd become a queen, and every step of that journey, every moment of pain and triumph, had led me here to this moment, to this man, to this life I'd been meant to live all along. The music swelled. Our dance continued, and outside the windows, the moon rose full and bright, blessing us as she'd blessed us a decade ago in a forest that no longer existed except in memory. But memory was enough. Love was enough. We were enough together, bound and unbreakable, now and forever. 3 months after the anniversary celebration, the first real test of our reign arrived in the form of a messenger from the Eastern Territories. He came at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. I was in the council chamber when he burst in, barely waiting for permission to speak. Your Majesties, he gasped, dropping to one knee. The eastern border is under attack. Not by men, but by something else. Something from the old stories. My blood ran cold. I knew immediately what he meant. The old stories were filled with creatures that had been bound or banished by the ancient priestesses. Things of shadow and hunger that fed on fear and chaos. If those bindings were breaking, if those creatures were returning, it meant the balance of magic itself was shifting. Describe what you've seen, I commanded, and felt the weight of my crown settle more heavily on my head. This was what queenship meant. Not just ceremonies and politics, but responsibility for every life in the kingdom. The messenger's hands shook as he spoke. They come at night, creatures made of darkness that seem to seep from the ground itself. They drain the life from everything they touch. Crops wither, animals die, people fall into sleep they never wake from. We've lost 3 villages already, Your Majesty. The survivors are fleeing west, but the shadow things follow them. Beside me, he tensed, his hand moving instinctively to where his sword would hang. How many fighters do we have stationed in the east? 200, my lord. But swords do nothing against these creatures. They pass through steel like smoke. Magic, I said quietly. They're creatures of old magic. They can only be fought with the same. I turned to face the council, saw the fear and doubt in their eyes. Many of them still didn't trust my power, still saw me as a foreign threat rather than their queen. But now we'd see if their fear of the unknown outweighed their fear of me. I need to go to the eastern border. I'm the only one here trained to deal with creatures like this. Absolutely not, said Lord Graves, one of my most persistent critics. You're the queen. You can't risk yourself on some foolish quest to fight shadows. Send the army. Send priests. Send anyone but yourself. The army is useless against shadow creatures, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering in my chest. And your priests don't have the training or knowledge to combat old magic. I do. I was raised for this. She's right, said the young progressive lord, now a key ally. If these creatures are what the messenger describes, conventional forces will be slaughtered. We need someone who understands the old ways. I'll go with her, he said, his voice brooking no argument. The queen doesn't travel into danger alone. The kingdom needs its king, I protested. If something happens to you, then it happens to both of us or neither. He took my hand, and I felt the binding pulse between us, warm and reassuring. That's what being bound means, remember? We face everything together. The council erupted in protests, but he silenced them with a single raised hand. The decision is made. We leave within the hour. Lord Graves, you'll oversee the kingdom in our absence. Lady Thornhill, prepare supply wagons and a company of our best riders. Everyone else, see to the refugees. They'll need food, shelter, and reassurance that we're not abandoning them to the shadows. As the council dispersed, still muttering their objections, he pulled me aside. Can you really fight these things? I was trained to, I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. Shadow creatures are manifestations of corrupted magic. They're drawn to places where the veil between worlds is thin, where old bindings have weakened or broken. If I can find the source, the anchor point where they're entering our world, I can reseal it. And if you can't? I met his eyes, saw my own fear reflected there. Then we'll find another way. We always do. The ride east took 3 days, and with each mile I felt the wrongness growing stronger. The air tasted of copper and decay. Birds fell silent as we passed. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer, filtered through a haze that shouldn't exist. The refugees we encountered along the road told stories that made my skin crawl. Entire families drained of life in their sleep. Animals found as empty husks. A creeping cold that froze the soul before it froze the body. On the 3rd night, we made camp at the edge of the infected zone. I could feel the shadow creatures beyond the firelight, circling, watching, waiting. They were testing our defenses, looking for weakness. I'd drawn protective wards around the camp using symbols my mother had taught me, ancient marks of power that glowed faintly in the darkness. Tell me about them, he said as we sat together by the fire, his arm around my shoulders. These shadow creatures, what are they really? They're mistakes, I said quietly. Failed experiments from the early days of magic, when priestesses tried to create life from nothing. The creatures they made were wrong, hungry, unable to sustain themselves except by feeding on the life force of others. The priestesses realized their error and bound the creatures in a prison between worlds, a place where they couldn't hurt anyone. But bindings fade over time, especially when there are no priestesses left to maintain them. So by destroying the Riverlands, by killing the priestesses, they inadvertently released these things. Eventually, yes. It might have taken years or decades, but without anyone to maintain the seals, the creatures would inevitably break free. I leaned into his warmth, trying to draw comfort from his solid presence. It's poetic in a terrible way. They feared our magic so much that they destroyed us, and in doing so, they unleashed something far worse. Can you reseal them? I think so. The ritual is complex and it requires a massive amount of power, but I remember the words, the gestures. My mother made sure I knew them, even though she hoped I'd never need to use them. I looked up at him, at the firelight playing across his features. But there's a cost. There's always a cost with magic this powerful. His jaw tightened. What kind of cost? To life force? The seal requires a sacrifice of life energy to anchor it. Not death necessarily, but years, decades potentially. Whoever performs the ritual will age, will give up part of their life to power the binding. Then I'll do it, he said immediately. I'll provide the life force. You just focus on the ritual itself. No, the word came out sharper than I intended. You're the king. The kingdom needs you young and strong, able to rule for decades to come. I'm the priestess. This is my responsibility, my calling. I'll bear the cost. Ilara, this isn't negotiable. I cupped his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. Promise me you won't try to interfere. Promise me you'll let me do what I was trained to do. He looked like he wanted to argue, but finally he nodded. I promise, but I won't lose you to this. Whatever happens, we find a way to minimize the cost. Together. Together, I agreed, and kissed him with all the desperate love and fear churning in my chest. The next morning, we pressed deeper into the infected zone. The shadow creatures grew bolder as we approached their anchor point, manifesting in half-solid forms that seemed to drink the light itself. My protective wards held them at bay, but I could feel the strain, the constant pressure of their hunger pushing against my defenses. The soldiers with us were terrified, their faces pale, their hands shaking on their weapons. Only he remained calm, his presence a steady anchor beside me. We found the anchor point at the ruins of an old temple, one that had been destroyed long before even my mother's time. The stones were covered in moss and vines, but I could still see the faint traces of the original wards, now broken and useless. At the center of the ruins, a crack had opened in the fabric of reality, a wound in the world through which the shadow creatures poured like blood from a cut. This is it, I said, feeling the power of the place thrumming through my bones. This is where I'll perform the ritual. The old priestess who'd testified at my coronation had insisted on joining our company, and now she stepped forward, her ancient face grave. I can help channel the power, spread the cost between us. I'm old already, child. A few more years won't matter. Relief and gratitude flooded through me. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This will hurt. Magic always hurts when you're using it to mend what's broken. She took my hand and I felt her power, diminished by age but still present, still capable. When you're ready, we begin. I looked at him one last time, memorizing every detail of his face. If the ritual took too much, if I aged beyond recovery or lost myself in the magic, I wanted this moment burned into my memory. He seemed to understand, stepping close to press his forehead to mine. Come back to me, he whispered. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, come back. Always, I promised. I'll always come back to you. I stepped into the center of the ruins, the old priestess beside me, and began to speak the words my mother had taught me. The language was older than kingdoms, older than writing, each syllable a key that unlocked vast reservoirs of power. I felt magic rising from the earth, from the stones, from my own blood and bone. The air shimmered and twisted, reality bending to my will. The shadow creatures screamed, their voices like wind through a broken window, and rushed toward us in a wave of darkness. But I was faster, my words weaving a net of light and power that caught them, held them, began to drag them back toward the wound in the world. They fought, thrashing and shrieking, but magic older and stronger than their hunger bound them tight. I felt the cost beginning, felt my life force flowing out of me and into the spell. My hair, which had grown past my shoulders, began to grey at the roots. Fine lines appeared at the corners of my eyes. My hands, young and smooth, started to show the first signs of age. Beside me, the old priestess sagged, her already ancient body bending further under the weight of the magic. But we didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The ritual had to be completed, or the shadow creatures would tear free and devastate everything. I pushed harder, digging deeper into my reserves of power and life, feeling years peel away like layers of skin. Distantly, I heard him shouting, felt him trying to reach me through the barrier of magic I'd erected, but I couldn't let him through. Couldn't let him sacrifice himself for this. The wound in the world began to close. Slowly, agonizingly, the edges drew together, sealing the shadow creatures back in their prison. The last one disappeared with a wail of frustrated hunger, and the crack sealed with a flash of brilliant light that burned away the unnatural haze and let true sunlight touch the ground for the first time in weeks. I collapsed, my legs giving out, my vision swimming. The old priestess crumpled beside me, her breathing shallow but steady. I tried to assess the damage to see how much the ritual had taken, but exhaustion dragged at me like chains. I felt hands catch me before I hit the ground, heard his voice saying my name over and over, desperate and afraid. "I'm here," I managed to whisper. "I'm still here." When I finally opened my eyes again, I was back in our tent, wrapped in furs and blankets. He sat beside me, his hand clutching mine, his face haggard with worry. "How long?" I asked, my voice rasping. 2 days. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. He lifted my hand to his lips, kissing my knuckles gently. "The old priestess woke yesterday. She says the ritual worked, that the seal will hold for at least a century. But Ilara, the cost, how bad is it?" I forced myself to sit up, to look at my reflection in the polished metal of his armor. The woman staring back at me was still recognizably me, but older. Not ancient, thank the gods, but I'd aged perhaps 10 or 15 years. My hair was shot through with silver, my face marked with lines that spoke of worry and pain. I looked like a woman in her mid-30s rather than early 20s. "You're still beautiful," he said fiercely. "You're still yourself, that's all that matters." But I could see the grief in his eyes, the knowledge that I'd sacrificed years we should have had together. "The binding," I said suddenly. "Does it still—" "Yes." He pulled me close, and I felt it immediately, that connection between our souls still thrumming with life and love. "The binding doesn't care about age or appearance. We're still one, still bound, still eternal." Relief crashed over me so powerfully I started to cry. I was afraid. I thought maybe the magic would have damaged it, broken what we are. "Nothing can break us." He held me while I wept, his own tears falling into my hair. "But gods, Ilara, when I saw you aging, saw the life draining from you to power that spell, I thought I'd lose you. I thought despite all our promises, despite the binding, you'd slip away into magic and leave me behind. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I frightened you, but I had to do it. Those creatures would have destroyed everything." "I know. And I'm so proud of you, so awed by your strength and sacrifice. But I'm also angry that it had to be you, that you had to pay this price." He pulled back enough to look at me, his grey eyes intense. "No more sacrifices. No more giving up pieces of yourself. We find other ways to solve problems. Together. Promise me." "I promise," I said, meaning it with every fibre of my being. No more sacrifices. The journey back to the castle took longer than the journey out. I was weak, my body adjusting to the sudden aging, my magic depleted to almost nothing. But as we travelled, I saw the land healing. The refugees were returning to their homes, finding their crops growing again, their animals healthy. Children played in village squares that had been deserted. Life was returning, and I'd made that possible. When we finally reached the castle, the news of what I'd done had preceded us. The court turned out to greet us, and I saw something different in their faces. Not fear or resentment, but respect, maybe even admiration. I'd proven myself in the most fundamental way possible, sacrificing my own youth to protect them. Even my harshest critics couldn't deny that. Lady Thornhill, who'd been managing the castle in our absence, approached and knelt before me. "Your Majesty, the kingdom owes you a debt that can never be repaid." "No debt," I said, surprised by how rough my voice sounded. I did what any queen should do for her people, what any priestess was trained to do. But they wouldn't let it rest. Over the following weeks, bards began composing songs about the queen who walked into shadow. Artists painted murals showing me facing down the creatures, light blazing from my hands. Children in the streets played games where they pretended to be me, sealing imaginary monsters away. I'd become, quite without meaning to, a legend. The strangest part was how it changed the way people treated me. The nobles who'd once questioned my right to wear the crown now sought my counsel. The common people brought their problems directly to me, trusting that I'd understand and help. Even the priests who'd been suspicious of my magic now acknowledged that what I'd done was holy, a sacred act of protection and sacrifice. But the cost weighed on me more than I'd expected. Looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger's face, feeling my body move differently, with less ease and more care. Watching him look at me and seeing the grief he tried to hide, the knowledge that we'd lost years together that we could never get back. The binding hadn't weakened, but I felt a distance that hadn't existed before. A reminder that I'd changed in ways that went beyond the physical. One night, several months after our return, I found myself unable to sleep. I stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, watching the moon paint everything silver. I heard him come up behind me, felt his arms wrap around my waist. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That I look like I could be your older sister now instead of your wife," I said, trying to make it sound like a joke, but failing. "You look like my queen, my bound mate, the woman who saved my kingdom at tremendous personal cost." He turned me around to face him. "Age is just years, Ilara. The binding doesn't see it. I don't see it. When I look at you, I see the soul I've loved across lifetimes, the magic that called to mine, the courage that never wavers. But we lost time. Years we should have had young together. We have eternity," he reminded me. "The binding transcends death, remember? This life is just one chapter in a story that will never end. So you're a bit older now, so what? We'll grow old together anyway, just at slightly different rates. And then we'll die and be reborn and find each other again. And do it all over." His words settled something restless inside me. He was right. The binding was forever. What did a decade or two matter against that vastness? "I love you," I said, and meant it with every aged year, every silver hair, every line on my face. "And I love you. Always have, always will." He kissed me under the moon. And the binding sang between us, as strong and true as it had ever been. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine in the telling, I'd love to hear from you. Every story finds its power in the connection between teller and listener, writer and reader. Share your thoughts below. Tell me what resonated with you, what made you feel, what stayed with you after the last word. And if you found yourself drawn into Ilara's world, into the magic and the romance and the struggle between destiny and choice, I hope you'll stay with me for future stories. There are so many more tales to tell, so many more characters waiting to have their voices heard. Until then, may you find your own bindings, your own connections that transcend the ordinary, your own magic that makes the impossible real.